Hello and welcome back to Varn Vlog. And today I'm here with my erstwhile former co-host, Amogh Sahu, doctoral candidate somewhere in New York. Where are you at, doctoral candidate again?
Colombia.
Columbia. I thought it was one of those big fancy schools. Um, Amogh and I have known each other a decade, actually a little longer than that, but we started working together around 2014. Now, I was a much younger man. Um,
By definition.
Yeah, by definition. And so you are not yet a man. I think you were like 18 years old when you approached me the first time.
Mhm.
Um, Now we've gone over some of this in our symptomatic redness in review. Symptomatic redness, I feel like, has become sort of a cult fascination, like the OG episodes of Pop the Left, which is actually, as we talked about in our discussion about this, man, even that discussion's almost 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, I was prompted by the fact that I'm about in the archives for when we ended the first run of symptomatic redness. And I realized that it has been almost as long since we ended it than since we began it. The reason why it was ended, frankly, was I was thinking about leaving podcasting altogether in light of my divorce and had talked Doug Lane into letting me do an art show, something that he um, was to eventually renegotiate and have me do Pop the Left, um, which was a return to a prior form. Um, Now, since we've talked and that's happened, Pop the Left has also gone on an incarnation without me for a little while between Pascal Robert and Chris Catrone as co-host, which I think became the Catrone Zone. There was several attempts by Doug Lane and Sublation to resurrect Pop the Left again with me. Doug and I have not made that work for whatever number of reasons. Sometimes I'll pop in and talk to him. But our politics have drifted further and further apart over time. They were never that close, however. I think that's one of the things that people have realized only in retrospect, that people read Doug through me and me through Doug. And I've always said if you wanted to understand what I was on, you would listen to my discussions with Amogh way back in the day. Now, one of the things about that, and there's some lost discussions that I don't even have the archive for. So there's this long discussion where we went through, I think it was varieties of cultural Marxism, where I went through the various cultural Marxism theories with you. When we went through William Lind, and that episode's completely lost. There is an awesome interview we did with Eric Owen Wright, and that episode died on a computer. It's now become infamous because my Apple laptop of the time got water on it when
Oh,
moving
wow.
from
Egypt, right?
from moving from Mexico to Egypt.
Right.
So one of the last things I did when I lived in Mexico, back when Mark Fisher was still alive, so you can how long ago this um, was end my relationship with the North Star and record for you a piece with Eric Owen Wright on his Understanding Class book. I always wanted to redo that conversation, although in hindsight, I think you and I both agreed that that conversation was a mess.
Hmm.
And it is funny because we're now like, I feel like we have to be careful, but we don't want to slag off on a dead man on a podcast that's never released and you can't get.
And also,
Um,
it wasn't just because of him that it was a mess, I guess we have to say.
no, we were unable to rein him in. I think I would be able to now because I've read that book like 3 times as opposed to then when it was fresh and came out. And you and I were just kind of like flying by the seat of our pants on a book we just read.
Sure.
Um, uh, but I was going to ask you, you went from policy MMTer, and I want to talk to you about where MMT has gone since you sort of moved away from that heterodox policy world, because I think it's
Hmm.
gone off a cliff even since we have talked last.
Hmm.
Um, like it is facing a cul-de-sac of its own allegiances that have had theoretical repercussions as well.
Hmm.
Uh, and you started looking for the source of Marxism, and I went to Kotsky for a little while, and you went to Lukács.
Yeah.
And you went to Lukács almost. And when you told me you were a Lukács scholar, Amogh, I almost took it personally. It could be worse. You could have told me you were an Althusser scholar, which I would have taken personally. I'd be like, well, this is obviously the anxiety of influence, some weird Oedipal stuff you got going on here. But but in a real sense, like Lukács for me, and I'm glad that through you and through my engagements of re-engagement with platypus, I've had to like in my conversations with Daniel Todd, I've had to face him, come to terms with both Lukács and Althusser as these paradigmic figures that are paradigms for a time in history that you and I aren't, but that until very recently, I really do think define the left. The crisis of the humanism, anti-humanism, the greats, and the crisis of Hegelian Marxism, which is a misnomer, versus scientific Marxism, which is also a misnomer, which are these debates that kind of collapsed into either postmodernism or Alvin Gouldner, depending on which way you went, in the 1970s. Through what I think, and as an intellectual genealogical history, I think two things happened. One, Zizek became a phenomenon. Two, Zizek became a phenomenon partly in response to the financial crisis, but also partly in response to the fact that while Foucauldian and Deleuzian forms of post-structuralism are still kind of viable academically, the Derridian, Horace Mann, Paul de Man, Horace Mann, all that stuff exhausted itself pretty quickly in the middle of the aughts when I was in grad school and you were in high school. And these things interestingly corresponded with one another. Like the turn against Derrida happened partly because of death, but also partly because that style of leftism didn't speak to people even before the financial crisis. It was already beginning to feel tired. And
like we think of it as a 90s thing.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to a scholar at an intellectual history conference, a scholar of postmodernism, and she was like, the irony of now is I'm the only postmodernist in the room, and now I'm the dinosaur. Everyone else even thinks that periodization doesn't even hold. So I find that interesting.
Yeah.
But and I'm blabbing. I haven't let you intervene yet. So you have also completed basically a scope of higher education from undergrad to you're completing. You're nearing the end of at least probably your funded portion of your PhD.
There you go. Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah.
You're now into the I gotta work and finish my dis land.
Yep.
I have not been there, but a lot of people close to me have. So knowing that about you, and you've also gone through a period of, and in some ways, you and I have stayed in touch with each other to some degree, of responding to various trends on the left. When you and I talked all the way back in 2014, when you were interested in Stephen King and Philip Murawski, and I will say you brought Philip Murawski into my life, and he of these post Keynesian types is the one that stuck.
Yeah. I was going to say those two, like, don't put them on the same level.
Oh no! I mean, people should go back and listen to our interview with Murawski and Stephen King, which are some of our very earliest interviews, and it's a night and day difference. Like Steve King is, I think, sabotaged by the realities that are about to hit Syriza. That I'm not, that early period of European populism in the early teens, I was one of the few people on the left who was strongly skeptical of it. And now people are like, well, if we only had listened to Yanis Varoufakis, I'm like, but they did kind of listen to Yanis Varoufakis, and he got backstabbed, but he kind of got backstabbed because his plan didn't make sense.
Yeah.
Like, the plan was kind of based on not having to pull the trigger, and Giannis would have pulled it. We don't know how it would have turned. I don't know that it would have turned out. Seeing how bad, the conditions of the core of the EU ended up for Greece, I'm not sure that it would have been worse for them to collapse their economy and try out semi-autarky. But it could have been. So, but I now no longer see it as necessarily stupid, because both things ended up being so incredibly hard because they did not. It was one of those things where if you swing at the king, you best not miss, and they missed.
Yeah.
Maybe taking their bomb going home would have gone well. So you hear that with Keane. Keane's analysis is very like of the moment.
Yeah.
Morawski's analysis of neoliberalism has completely changed my view of what neoliberalism was.
Yeah.
The way that the left back then, and to a large degree the left now, although it is less problematic unless you're reading someone like Bong Chul Han, than it used to be. People do kind of realize that neoliberalism is not just deregulation, or it's not just anti-Fordism, that even someone like Gabriel Winant has picked up on the Morawski stuff and like pointed out how it actually worked in healthcare and whatever, and that there is a sense in which neoliberalism is dependent on either Keynesian social democracy or U.S. Fordism with a little bit of Keynesianism to even happen.
Yeah.
Right. And people have figured out the paradox of what I like to call the Naomi Klein's dumb book paradox, or why the shock doctrine was a Naomi Klein avoiding the history that she actually spelled out, which her history is, well, these social democratic and Keynesian policymakers seem to capitulate to the right more in the long run, and Peronists, etc. Therefore, we need to double down on non-dogmatic leftism, aka Keynesianism, because it'll help us fight the conspiracy of the Chicago boys who are causing people to. Yeah, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Also,
I mean, the story about Chile, I won't even get into. I mean, everyone knows it's crazy to think that it was the Chicago boys who made that happen. I'm not saying they didn't play a role, but that can't.
Well, then tying it to the Iraq War was particularly ridiculous.
Yeah,
like
totally different material situations, like whatever. And the Allende. I mean, this is all a way of not talking about the Allende regime, which we should talk about. That's not to say everything was fine under Pinochet or whatever, but it's the Chicago boys thing has always annoyed me, because it's a sort of ex nihilo, these bad people came in from nowhere and transformed a great situation into a bad one.
Right. Well, what I find interesting is in some ways the left has completely changed since you and I entered this thing, but that tendency to find an externality to focus on, as opposed to focusing on even your role and how the externality was able to play a role in the first place, that's become worse actually since 2012, 2014.
Right.
What
is it now?
I mean, what's funny is you have this perpetual rolling back, and that wasn't new. You and I were talking about people trying to go further and further back in socialist history, we can get past the new left if we can only jump to the 1920s or whatever. Right. Our pure Marx are, what we just have to skip the old left. What I learned from our shows, actually, and I really did learn this in the process of doing the shows with you, which got me back into Christopher Lasch and all that, was that wasn't true. That actually we were recapitulating the same things the New Left did, but often with opposite assumptions. So we came in with initially like criticizing the New Left, but having New Left assumptions. Like we can separate Marx from Engels and Kautsky from pre-Kautskyan socialism, and Lenin from Kautsky, and we can, and Stalin from Lenin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like we can isolate these key figures and completely divorce them from later figures we find problematic.
Right.
That has stopped, I think. But I do think that was the influence of New Left historiography on Gen X and millennial leftists, and so much as there were any when we're at the time here we're talking about. But that's manifested even in the Bernie movement. Like Bernie democratic socialism is actually the revenge of a prior form of managerial workerism that replaced, that was in competition with a kind of anarchism that became dominant in subcultural spaces in the 90s and early aughts. That kind of begins and manifested in the outer globalization movement, which is where I enter, like my real relationship with the left enters at that time.
It was a kind of coalition of those two things, which is what was very weird. Like it took Occupy, and then it took the sort of Harringtonite DSA, and then it took a bunch of Trot tendencies and kind of mushed them all up together. Like, the DSA stuff is, I mean, I'm sure you know the ISO DSA pipeline, or the Trot Sec DSA pipeline, right? So it's I
mean, I've done whole episodes about American Trotsky. World Trotskyism is dying, except in Latin America. It still exists in Latin America, I guess, because it's a large dissident tendency that has a long tradition and is still reacting to the same things. Whereas in Europe, it liquidated itself into Corbynism, and in the United States, it liquidated itself into the DSA, and only recently has tried to re-emerge from that, and failed. And the prior forms of let's say anti-democratic socialist forms of Trotskyism have just become anti-revisionism / Marxist-Leninism, that like if you really push the leaders of the PSL and the WWP, they'll admit that that they're inspired by Sam Marcy, but they'll try to play down that he remained a trot all of his life.
Right.
But what's interesting about that kind of intellectual genealogy doesn't interest me as much now, actually, as it did when you and I met. What interests me is the conditions in which those things are no longer viable, because Trotskyism in America, with the exception of kind of the IMT and a few other orthodox Trot organizations, which are all tiny, has completely collapsed. Just collapsed in the light of the DSA. But as we talk this very day, Amogh, the DSA is facing fiscal dissolution. If it's not careful, it's going to have to completely restructure its finances to survive. And that means that we are, in a very real sense, come full circle from where the left that you kind of entered in, that caused you to come to me all those years ago. Like, I think you've actually seen it arise and fall. But it's also taking other things with it. So like this heterodox economic space that you came into this for, right? And that I was like a little counter devil screaming in your ear. Like that's also gone full circle. In light of economic changes in global economy. And like, I know people will defend Michael Hudson or whatever, or Nathan Tankis, but I've really noticed that their predictions have gotten more and more ad hoc, and that they can't explain basic things. And that there's this kind of dialectic with someone like Hudson, where like 1 week he's pronouncing the imminent collapse of the American economy because of the problems of finance capital, and on the next week trying to like stall and not people notice that the same slowdown has affected China. And the only way you can explain that isn't like, oh, they're becoming more and more, in decoupling, they're actually becoming more and more like the United States, but now a middle income country and not a high income one. Then it makes it like, oh, all this actually was a bunch of a smoke without fire, like, and that we have to not look at the actual trends on the ground,
So
and yeah,
maybe we should start with a question.
yeah. Well, I mean, this is a long preamble,
right?
What do you think happened? Like this 20-minute preamble to a question, Amogh.
It's good to be back, Derek. It's good to be back.
No, seriously, what is your experience like? I find that Corbynism, if we look at Corbynism as kind of something that may presage what may be happening to the US left in the victory of Biden, it's actually quite weird because the British left that used to dominate the American left when you and I first came in here has completely dissolved. It's like gone from the world stage. It's almost like it never happened.
I mean, it's like it's not completely gone, but it doesn't have like a world historical thing. Like, Alex Kalin, no one's reading Alex Kalinikos, I think, but people used to.
What I find interesting, I think I might have a contestation. Like, I think people's affection for, say, Mark Fisher is actually a sign of the same kind of hauntology that he was critiquing. Like, they have nostalgia for his nostalgia and critique of that nostalgia that he was feeling. And yet, Mark Fisher's only been dead, what, 5 years? 6 years. I mean, he died right before I quit doing Symptomatic Redness. So I bring all that up. I'm gonna let you. What have you seen? You're in the epicenter of global leftism. I mean, there's two. There's the California form, in which there are two different varieties: the southern and the northern. Northern leftism is no longer leftism, I don't think. I would also say there's the New York form. You're in the belly of the beast. And there was the London form, but I mean, it kind of exists. But I mean, it seems like there's more leftists probably writing for Compact Magazine and complaining about wokeness and from the UK, just trying to like basically tail what defeated them, than there are anyone actually seriously doing anything of an independent left wing there. And if things go for the DSA the way they seem to be going, they're going to collapse just slightly faster than they grew.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, what happened over the last decade to the American left? Okay. Let's see. I guess lessons learned. The first thing is, don't fixate on any particular organizational form, because that's not going to tell you much about where the left is at. There is what the left is this like big section of society. We can talk about what the class fraction is. That isn't so important. But what's important right now is that, like, for some structural reason, it isn't organized. It manifests in organization sometimes. DSA, Bernie, whatever the fuck, doesn't matter, right? But the organizations don't stick. We've seen this on the radical left, but this is true for the social democratic left more broadly, actually. That like organizations either dissolve outright or they just kind of push on with no organizational momentum, right? And there's just this whole kind of like ML kind of idea that you look at the organization to see the politics, right? Or to look at the party to see the politics. Like that's not how it works. Your brain is going to explode if you like track the underlying strength of the left by like the 50,000 different organizational shapes that rise and fall, right? So that's the first thing, right? Same thing with the DSA, like, if the DSA collapses back down to its, pre-2014 shape or whatever the fuck, to some people that will mean reformist left gone away, but that's stupid. We can't think that way, right? The point is just organization's not sticky. Hard to organize anything. First thing. Second thing, left big enough to not be ignored, but not big enough to do anything. And this kind of sucks. It sucks if you're a doomer, because, every now and then the left gets something done. Not as much as it wants to get done, not as much as they expected, but enough so that if you're a doomer, you will just continually be annoyed. Right. I'm not saying you'd be wrong. It's just you'll be annoyed because new things keep cropping up and people keep getting hopeful. Right.
Right. Exactly. So we can't go full Benjamin Studebaker yet.
Exactly. Yeah. So left is big enough to annoy doomers. Right. But left is small enough to annoy teleologists and theory of history progress people as well. Because, anything that gets done is never the first win in a long series of wins. It really,
it's more sarcastic than that. Yeah, we can't even predict what we actually often can't predict what, if you were to ask me what the left was going to get done, I am completely right about what it's going to get wrong more often than not, but I'm actually not right about what it's going to get right. And a lot of it doesn't make sense. Like, for example, yes, the early UAW was very democratic, but it really hadn't been democratic since, I don't know, the 1940s.
Right.
And this leads us all the way out. How do I say this? This leads us all the way out towards, to now. I would not have expected that the UAW, even with its orientation in the wars within it, which I knew about, would go back to actually fighting on the factory level.
Right.
But I can predict that the left will take that as a fait accompli that it isn't, particularly in light of probably Bureau of Labor Statistics probably going to indicate again that we've seen even less union density than we had last year. That's what we can predict.
Right.
And what I find interesting about that is, the Marxist-Leninists may talk about the reformist leftists, but and the doomers may talk about the dumb copers. But the most honest person I've talked to about this is Ben Fong, the Jacobin labor reporter guy. That's and yet also one of the people who's most infuriated me on their kind of like blind pragmatism and distorting the opinion has been Ryan Grimm, the Intercept / Jacobin labor reporter guy. So right. It's been like the counter tendencies haven't been where you see people tracking this either.
Right. So when I say big enough to do stuff, I absolutely do not mean big enough to execute a program. I mean literally like big enough to have some kind of political impact, which is, like meaningful in some way. I don't mean, so it's like, as I say, big enough to annoy doomers. That's my measure. My measure. That's
big enough to give people false hope about the squad.
Yep.
Big enough to give to help that out. Big enough to get, what is it? DSA claims like 100 electeds at city council levels and whatnot.
Right.
And but not big enough to even stop there from being reprisals in New York City against DSA. The DSA machine there by the Democrats at all. Like they're now getting crushed in that as we speak. So it's like it's actually very similar to what Adorno was, was complaining about in the 60s, where it's big enough for you to feel like you're making movement, get addicted to that feeling, not actually change anything, and tread water. I
Yeah.
guess maybe it's and unfortunately for Adorno, you don't ever hit the point where like we collapse into the totality of post-Fordist administrative state fascism that he
Yeah.
thinks exists.
Well, that's annoying because he's wrong about that too, in the sense that like it's not like it would be nice and easy if society was one dimensional, you know. Um, Set aside whether Adorno said this, don't really care about that right now. The point is just that, this idea that the left is a subculture is just kind of wrong. It's a subculture relative to where it needs to be or whatever, right? It's like it's a subculture relative to what it thinks it is, right? In the sense that if your comparison is like the world spirit or like the subject object of history, then yeah, sure, it's a subculture. It's like one part of a political coalition, which it's a kind of the unruly kid in that coalition. And that's if if your aspirations are to like run the world or whatever, then yeah, sure, you're a subculture. But like objectively, it is not a subculture. If you want to understand American national politics, you have to have an understanding of what the left's going to do and what pressure it's going to put on blah blah blah, right? It's just so that's why the kind of doomer subculture position is just like you're deciding not to think about the thing you're talking about. You're just like, it's a kind of nostalgia of its own, because it's like, because it's not what Lenin would have wanted in 1918, it is a subculture. But the annoying thing is, this doesn't mean the optimists are right, because saying it's not a subculture doesn't mean it's like this rising political movement. It's something in the middle
that can drive a program. I mean, one of the things I find very interesting that actually fits conservative critiques of the left, believe it or not, is that the left can and does have an outmoded effect on the culture of liberal radical discourse.
Yeah.
Like, and it is not the same as that subculture. Like kids on TikTok doing dumb left wing things.
Yeah.
And in some ways that is very different from the 90s. Like when we talk about campus culture, I didn't meet high school students who were speaking about heteronormativity in the mid 1990s. Right, given the way that the left was talking in the 1990s that I inherited later. Occasionally you met someone who read a zine that spelled women with a Y. Like, and you had no idea exactly where that came from, but you had a sort of idea that those language shifts reflected something going on in academia that probably went back to the 70s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a real sense in which, the Combahee River Collective now actually had an effect on AP Black Studies in a way that actually backlash, but meant that it rippled throughout the entire culture that would have not happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s at all. It would have happened in the 60s, but even then, when you go back and like look at popular culture, the popular culture was not really talking about like new left ideas from 65 to 68 until after the fact. And even then it was mostly about how they were dying in yippie and hippie subcultures. So I think that's interesting to think about. And it's also interesting because the left had an effect there too, but not enough of effect to change, say, neoliberalization. It had a way in which it was actually changing the way people talked. Way back in an early episode of the show, when we interviewed Alex Sasha Day corrected my assertion that like, oh, there'd been all this Maoist influence on liberal thinking through the new left, and I was getting that from Mike McNair. He complained about that too. And Alex Ashade said, well, uh, that's not entirely fair. What you have is convergent thinking, of which Maoist vocabulary was picked up by the New Left and popularized and
Right.
gave people a way to speak about it. But the developments were actually already happening convergently, right? And that was from our early interviews, like the Philip Morawski thing. That's something I've taken forward to really look at, that like the left has a way of reframing, but not setting the terms of, but changing and shifting the terms of general cultural and political economic debates in a way that has an effect, but doesn't have an effect of mass politics, doesn't, and in
Right.
a real sense, like the kind of call of like Matt Christman style mass politics, to me, it misses that mass politics really are only normal when things are falling apart. Like, and by falling apart, I don't mean like now, not slowly, like acutely falling apart very quickly
Yeah.
in ways that hundreds of thousands of people are dying. Now, you know, tens of thousands of people are dying right now. Hundreds of thousands of people died during COVID, but even that's not enough to really recapitulate what happened in the beginning of the last century.
Yeah. I mean, just a quick thing on neoliberalization. I think this is another one of those myths that like people, the left didn't. I mean, I don't want to say victories, but the left had an effect. So welfare spending did not get rolled back to 1900 levels. That did not happen. You know, we did this idea that there was this like complete reversal of everything that happened post-war. No, there was not. State bureaucracies are big and they exist in Western countries. Welfare states are, again, not threadbare, being attacked, being whatever, all this stuff. They still exist. There's still stuff for libertarians to talk about and be angry about, etc., etc. And that happens through, ineffective resistance, piecemeal resistance, call it what you like. But, it's like the idea that suddenly in 1978, the left just like disappeared, packed up and went home is just nonsense. It's the sort of large vested interests that professional workers, nurses, doctors, all this stuff who were, I mean, now I guess are becoming more radicalized or whatever, but all the sort of, let's call it professional elite part of like the liberal coalition, and big trade unions, like they got integrated into the system, but through that they held their own more than they would like to admit. Um, you know, Kleiman has been
And I
making
think,
this point for a while, but yeah.
oh yeah, I mean, well, we're gonna have to. Climate ends up defending them, though. I mean,
Oh, I don't
we're
want
in
to
a
do that.
weird,
Yeah.
we're in this weird place where like one of the things that Clement was good at pointing out is, okay, he doesn't deal with wealth inequality that much, but he did deal with the fact that there's the income inequality was not actually maybe not as bad as you think, because
Yeah.
welfare spending was never really cut back. It was privatized, but it was already privatized in Fordism. Kleiman kind of doesn't talk about that.
Yeah.
He doesn't accept those periodologies really. He considers them as a regulation school intervention. And I kind of think like, well, just because the regulation school gave us names doesn't mean it isn't useful.
Right.
But because when you see how that operated, you see this crisis. To kind of, for me, in the long durée of the 20th century into the 21st century, you have the following kind of phases. You have monopoly capital as understood by Bakunin, not Bakunin, Bukharin, which was state monopolies having to adjudicate between different forms of capital, which was actually very old, but like was becoming a bigger and bigger part of the economy. It was actually returning to like this mercantilist style centralization in the beginning of the 20th century. That's what he thought was going to lead to imperialism. What he and anyone else didn't see was the bomb. Then you have the like Lenin classical imperialism. That's World War I. They think that's going to be solved by an imminent financial crisis once the imperial offset stops happening.
It's not.
That doesn't and never happens. And there is uh there is this shift to what what we now call the Fordist or the post-war social compact period or the Fordist period. The post-war social compact period covers a bunch of things.
Yeah.
Um, but there's a crisis in the management of capital. Claire Mattei writes about this, and Mattei it doesn't spend that much time talking about the non uh, the non-fascist version of that, but basically there is a real sense in which the James Vernon thesis is slightly true. You have this structuralization of capital, which leads to empowering management, and that you see this empowerment of a center nomenclature even in quote non-capitalist societies like the USSR. Actually, during our time of the show, since we're doing this tenure, I moved from a strict believer in kind of Raya Dunyaskaya state capital theory to being like, well, there's got to be a difference between what China is right now, which I think is clearly state capitalism, and what the USSR was doing, because there's huge differences in how that actually works. So the USSR seems to be acting as a capitalist actor on the global stage, but does not seem to be internally, which means that like it's not consistent. And that led me to well, maybe it's not really a consistent mode of production because it's being forced to act like a capitalist in one place and not another. And that's actually causing it to be, chaotic.
But internally, it's not acting like full Bordiga, abolish the market, whatever. It's acting like a crazy manager, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So it's. But yeah, no, I just wanted to say I just wanted to finish that thought that it's like it's capitalist outside, but we shouldn't. It's communist inside. If you you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I to me it gets is you get into this situation of not being able, like, I don't have a way to categorize uh the exact situation of the USSR, like, because if I look at it from certain perspectives, right, and this guy and Co are right. Like, it is particularly after 1935, once the initial industrial development is done, it is acting like a capitalist society. It's also pursuing an incoherent national policy, national internal and external, that leads to massive population resettlements and all that, which is totally why they were okay with Israel. It's not, like, it's but also what's driving that is fear of war. But the original feel of war is not like the Stalin was playing 85th degree chess and saw that he was going to be fighting the fascists. He literally thought he was going to be fighting the British Empire, and was setting up for war with them. Then the fascists betrayed him early. He seemed to be sincerely blindsided by their timing because it was literally irrational. Didn't feed any of the movements of history stuff, which also broke open a whole other series of problems for the Soviet Union. So you get this kind of interim period in which it's resolved, fascism is eliminated, but these other forms of management capital, Keynesianism and Fordism, which are related but not entirely the same. One is more private than the other, but they're both reliant on public-private partnerships and marketizations, etc. Not market socialism, even market manipulation and asset manipulations. And Keynes is very actively interested in like an elite level, and by elite I don't mean like loose PMC college educated. I mean he thinks like rich elites having socialism to embetter the working class, so the working class doesn't take power because he thinks they're incompetent.
Right.
Like, so you have that from Keynes, and then you get 20 years of that. The United States, however, does the Keynesian internationalism a la Palmatic. That's what I consider the 50s. that does throw the communists into total disorder because they're predicting that all the collapse forces that were stalled by the war are going to immediately come back. And that's true for Trotskyists and it's true for the Soviet Union. They both predict that, and it doesn't happen. Which then leads to people who are kind of independent of the Soviet Union, but trying to figure out why the Soviet Union can't get a handle on this, to come up with the monopoly capital theory, which is that, and the administrative apparatus theory, which one is kind of a more purely Marxist, one is a Frankfurt School Marxist adaptation to this. By the way, which is popular right now. But that argues that, without saying it, that James Burnham was kind of right, but it's just because we've settled the contradiction of capitalism through management. All right. The 70s throws that off because Fordism doesn't settle it. You start having stagflation, you start having capitalist dynamics seem to rear their heads. Neoliberalism starts, it seems to have gone through three different phases in my mind, like this early phase, which is really about breaking up public sector unions. The second phase, which is about rebuilding public-private partnerships, building up the healthcare infrastructure in this weird private hybrid ways.
Not getting rid of them.
Not getting rid of them,
Yeah.
Because they can't, because like whole cities would fall apart. The things would become socially unstable. They know that.
Right.
Nor is it really marketizing them. It's just, it is in the sense that liberal cliche that we started hearing around Occupy actually is correct. It is the privatization of risk it's the socialization of risk and the privatization of gains. Right. So like the public-private partnerships mean that people don't actually face that many consequences for their bad business institutions. That leads to this third phase of neoliberalism, which makes MMT look popular, where you start messing with currency flows because there's a real problem in unstable markets. People need investments. Investment returns are too low. Declining rates of profits does not indicate that profits are going to nothing. It indicates that investment rates are too low for them to be really profitable for people immediately. And so when people argue with me, well, how are people getting rich under this? I'm like, well, they're hoarding. That's a different thing than the rate of profit. Now, the problem that I've come to realize that I think is serious is we don't have a way to really measure the rate of profit that we all agree on, and Marx didn't figure it out. So we have all these things that make sense once you look at profit rates for physical commodities. Then you have these countervailing tendencies in rentier forms. And for a little while, I played around with this, right after we finished during the end of the Systematic Redness. I didn't go full neo-feudalism thesis, but I was like, there's so much rentierism in the economy. What is that saying, right? And there's asset inflation and asset bubbles, and we're stalling certain things by having asset bubbles. But eventually, this stuff is either going to get, someone's going to try to valorize it, and it's not going to be valorizable, and we realize that that's fake capital. Which, by the way, is what fictitious capital means. When MNTers laughed at us about fictitious capital, I'm like, no, if you can't valorize it, it isn't real. Like it only existed in value as in valuation until you tried to sell it. You can't actually sell it, so it's not real. That's what fictitious capital means. It's not valorizable. So we have this period of whatever we're in now, which I think is like people have been the left has been skirting the name in academic areas. At the same time, if we look at like the movement of what the left concerns are in our lifetime, starts off anti-war, is ending anti-war, but it's very different in the sense that now it's anti-war about proxy wars of which the U.S. is not technically in direct control. Whereas before it was anti-war about U.S. direct, almost colonialism, not just imperialism. And a lot of the monetary theories that it's forced with relies on somebody acting as an imperial power. Right. So that's my longue durée explanation of what happened in the 20th century. Then you have this kind of.
Could I just pause for a second? So I just wanted to. I think I agree with that history. I just wanted to replay the left bit of the last 40 years. So
go ahead. Yeah.
68, 70. I'm using left here to encompass, reformist progressive forces, like let's call it left liberal if you like, because if we get to the real left, it has much less effect, but okay, so my view is that the neoliberal revolution did not involve the complete crushing and elimination of this broad progressive left. Instead, it was bought off and integrated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the fact is that it systematically seeks to deny this. And in fact, a lot of people systematically seek to deny this. The libertarians, kind of like neoliberals who want to like overplay how much they did, kind of deny this. They said, Thatcher and Reagan broke the left, right? The left wants to say, oh, well, Thatcher and Reagan won, and so we were completely defeated. Lots of people want to skirt over this fact. But what happened was a new consensus. We reached, neoliberalism, a new consensus between like the broad reformist front, if we want to call it that, public and private sector trade unions, the Democratic Party, urban elites, all these people. These people didn't vanish, didn't go away. Instead, they lost a bunch of fights. They didn't get a bunch of things they wanted. And, but neither did the neoliberals, Reagan faced a Democratic Congress for most of his life, is what the Republicans cry about all the time. It's like, you keep complaining that Reagan spent so much, but it was the Democrats, whatever. But that shows you that there was, there was like a elite settlement, right? That there was, so all this stuff we're talking about, the welfare state didn't disappear, it became marketized, all of that happened because, the broad left liberal forces, they didn't go away. They were defeated, and they were defeated by being split and becoming bought off, right? That's why you could never do deep Medicare and Medicaid cuts, even though you couldn't expand them. You couldn't get rid of them entirely. You couldn't, even Trump talks about not being able to touch Social Security, all this sort of stuff, right? And like, I'm not saying any of this sort of threadbare compromise is like worth anything politically, even to reformists. But the point is just that, like, we keep seeing the world wrongly if we don't see the left as actors. If we just see, like, the neoliberals have got to have the run of everything without anyone, standing in their way.
So what I find interesting about that narrative is that and I agree with it, by the way, that it rhymes with the PMC narrative, but I think the PMC narrative is actually itself a way of avoiding that there's even from conservatives, because most of the conservatives who talk about it have adjacent relationships to the state or whatever. Like they are what they're complaining about almost always.
Right.
But in the left, it shoves a double bind. It's a way to say that these downward mobile people were a bad part of the left. They corrupted and got bought off.
Yeah.
I think Benjamin Studebaker is actually correct in pointing out that there's the successful elites, there's a rump elite, and there's the people who got pushed out for no fault of their own. And there's even people who got told that they could buy in, did what you were supposed to, and then found out there was no room for them.
Right.
So you have, Virginia, there is elite overproduction to some degree. But what people forget, the context of that elite overproduction was that there was not the space for traditional production to happen, and and the competition for jobs actually led for this category of what we consider professional jobs, which you need education to grow and grow and grow. Yeah. Which caused the sector to grow and grow and grow, which totally distorts the analysis from the 70s that this was based off of.
Right.
And also, I think it's a way to say that, well, there's a good socialist left at the core of this, or a good workerist left that were secretly in the unions this whole time. Maybe it was hidden in the rank and file. And the answer is no. Like, no, the left was part of this.
Yeah.
Right? It's realization that it couldn't piecemeal it anymore in 2007 and 2008, and it couldn't just be about moral crusades against war or whatever, has changed. And so you have the resurgence of early 20th century anti-imperialism talk, but which you heard a little bit in the anti-war movement of 2002 to 2007. But really, actually, the libertarian conservative argument about just, isolationism and whatever is really what won the day back
Right.
then.
Right.
And it didn't really win the day in the inauguration of Obama. So the other thing that we have to always deal with, and that people actively don't want to deal with, to put this not in abstract terms, I'm going to put it in the concrete political actors. Uh, the Atari Democrats emerged out of the New Left. They
Yep.
did.
Yep.
They are children of the New Left. They were reacting against it, but they also were from it and thought that it was actually right on its critiques of Fordism, its critiques of bureaucratic stuff, and it actually called a lot of those old new leftists cowards for backing down and defending the things they critiqued at the time. Then the people who responded to that got into like weird nationalisms imported from Mao after all that was over.
Right.
So you had this like stuff in the 80s that was celebrating developments in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and early 70s that was becoming full manifested after it was already done. You talk about, again, our Minerva, dust, blah, blah. Right.
And also, Atari Democrats are not complete free market people. They are managers. They want the state to invest in new technology, new industries. The difference is that they, like compare, if we're looking at the 84 Democratic primary, right, where this gets played out. Like, so you have Mondale, right, who's Carter's vice president, and he is the supposed old New Deal guy, and he wants to, he's in with the AFL-CIO and all these old kinds of actors. And you have Gary Hart, who's like the Atari Democrat who's running for president. And neither of them is a libertarian. One guy, Mondale, he wants to keep the old Democratic consensus running, and he wants to favor certain industries, and he wants to undo all the stuff that Reagan was doing. And then there's Hart, who's like, well, let them go. And then the answer isn't do nothing. The answer is fund a bunch of high-tech startups, whatever the fuck, and that goes, and Clinton takes that up, right? And it's like, the thing we forget is that Clinton in his first term, he didn't get his agenda through. He had a big investment agenda, right? And like, think of that what you will. I'm not defending any of that, but the point is just like, it is just wrong to call all these people like hands off, free market, whatever the fuck. They had like a specific managerial agenda for how to manage capitalism and whatever. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that's also wrong about the right. Like there's a reason why von Mises called Hayek a communist, right? Like, I mean, go back to our history, a la saint and patron of our old show, Symptomatic Redness, Philip Murawski.
I thought you were going to say Russell Jacoby, but
anyway. but actually, though, if you want to understand the two thinkers who were informing us the most when we were beginning that show, was Murawski, and that was from you. I was still going through my what do I make sense of my platypus and Adorno phase, and then for me, it was Jacoby and or Jacoby. I'm never quite sure how to say his name.
Neither do I. I don't know.
It was these 70s writers about what was happening in the New Left and the long durée of left communism. So that left us in lurch. And on one hand, we were trying to understand these conversations about money and economics, and I was really into Marxology in addition to my early Grand War in MMT, which I'm not returning to because I think it's not necessary now. I maintained a dogmatic view of money that I no longer have maintained. But two, I also think the MMT is hiding schisms within itself that make it an unviable product. Like, they cannot actually admit that they don't agree on key fundamental issues, and that like spectrum of sovereignty versus other forms of sovereignty is actually even a reversion to medieval ways of thinking and stuff like that. There's a whole big literature of MMT critique and whatnot that isn't just Marxist, that people have just kind of ignored because MMT sounds really good. It's like, oh, well, the government can't run on money, so there's no reason for fiscal austerity.
Right.
True, but the government can run out of a lot of other stuff, of which the currency is just, hiding those relationships, right? And so what I find interesting about the aughts and the aught teens to say, so you're right. There's this left that is integrated in,
Right.
and the Atari Democrats very rarely. They never get their agenda accomplished. They're always kind of stalled.
Right. But they stole the right as well, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Yeah.
And what you see with the right and the left is it actually becomes very clear that the right can only get parts of its agenda done in compromise when a left-wing president's in power, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Which is why, for right now, at this very moment, the House GOP is trying to force through a compromise on immigration that they don't think they'll get under Trump. And it's why, for all people want to talk about, well, Reagan didn't spend that much money. Well, then you can also say, well, Clinton didn't actually end welfare by himself either. It was a GOP Congress that helped him with that. And that wasn't something he initially planned to do. So there is an elite consensus, and the long durée thing, to go back to the 60s and 70s, it wasn't just a reformist left. It's not just the Bernie Sanderses. It was also the radicals. It was the Gene Kwans, Mayor of Oakland, et cetera, these radical thinkers who capitulated into the systems and eventually became, tied people into the Democratic Party. The people always are like, oh, AOC betrayed us like Nancy Pelosi. And I'm like, no, AOC was always Nancy Pelosi. You need to understand the history of Nancy Pelosi better.
Right. I mean, and this means saying the scary thing, which is Nancy Pelosi was never the kind of radical, red and tooth and claw capitalist that you thought she was. That it's this, it's not saying she's a socialist. She's not. She is what she says she is, which is a liberal Democrat. And so is AOC. And these people, they stick in the system, they put some sand in the gears, and they get one or two things done, and that's their politics. That's what they want, So it cuts both ways, right? It's like, if you admit that the left didn't lose every battle before 2007, then you have to admit that everything 2007 didn't change everything. Same thing with the Bernie thing. Like, Bernie sees himself as being on the same team as, someone like Biden, and people point this out as if it's a criticism, and it is a criticism partly, but also,
but it's a criticism made of him in specific context in Vermont in 1985,
right,
by Murray Bookchin, as much as it is by Alexander Coburn in 2012, as much as it is by Jimmy Dore in 2021. It's not new.
It's not new. Yeah, it's not new, and it's again, I'm going to sound like I'm defending these people. I don't want to defend the Democrats. I'm just saying they exist and are a viable political party which does things and is not crazily irrational. This doesn't mean I endorse their politics.
Right. Well, the idea that it was just bad actorness. Okay, yes, there's bad actorness, but we assume that politics is bad actorness. We actually totally should do that. Yeah. Is why these electoral coalitions can't work. That's just an assumption, right? Like, that's never been particularly true. Like, the Democrats are not any more bad actors than the Republicans. Both of their bases see their leadership as bad actors because the incentives are bad right now. And they're both promising something they can never give in the current context. And a lot of what the left has done, and the far right actually, has been to simultaneously admit that they can't do it, but also say we should demand more, but provide no means outside of dealing them as a way to do that. Which means that, for example, the DSA isn't getting betrayed by the Democrats. The DSA was a sucker.
Right.
Like, and it was a sucker in a way that I think you even back in the day, you and I were kind of hinting at this. Like, look, if you think you're going to be able to control the electeds with 100,000 people, you're wrong. But it's also not true that you had no effect on this in the first place. You changed the way these people had to pivot themselves. Now, you no longer have that effect.
Right.
Now, because you have been integrated.
Right.
Right.
And integrated, by the way, integrated means, I mean, integrated means you don't change the structure, but integrated means you do have some effect. It sort of cuts both ways, right? In the sense that, like, but neither political coalition gets enough done to satisfy itself, but it gets enough done to get the other side angry. If you want to know what the Republicans got done, you talk to a Democrat. If you want to know what Democrats got done, you talk to a Republican. Because that's the thing. It's because it's the Republican who will tell you, like, Biden's communist $1 trillion blah blah blah. Well, Democrats will compare Biden with what he hasn't done, right? Or like whatever it is, right? Same thing with Trump. Like, it's like, the Republicans the Democrats will tell you, oh, crazy tax cut, ICE, blah 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 blah. While the Republicans will tell you, oh my God, we were obstructed here, here, and here. This is the weird thing about the elite compromise. It's like, enough progress happens to create more conflict, but not enough happens to make anyone feel like they're getting anything.
So one of the things, I guess, to break this up, one, left theory has an effect on elites.
Mm-hmm.
Alvin Gildner style, C. Wright Mills style. Two, because of that, we can't say left theory is irrelevant. Three, left institutions exist, but they are largely incorporated into the state apparatus.
Yep.
Or they're downstream from it. Occasionally they will break out, UAW. But most of the time, they actually have to exist necessarily to control. I mean, one of the things is, one of the ironies of a union formation, and this is something Marxists realized all the time, even though they insist we still had to use them, is that the power of a union is also in having it not strike and be able to control its most militant elements. Otherwise, how can they represent themselves to get a contract?
Yep.
Right? There's no way they can if they actually cannot control elements of their actors. Similarly, for those of you who always like to give me, well, China can shoot Jack Ma and as somehow proof of its inherent anti-capitalism. Like, that's capital controls. Now, I would make a defense's case for China that there are still anti-capitalist aspirations and elements in it, but it's very thin. All right, and the fact that, like, it's now mirroring in its GDP growth the West, and decoupling seems to have proven that it was not ready to try to be even a region, like, it's going to be a regional hegemon, but like a regional hegemon in the way the US is, etc., that all this was premature, has been something that the left hasn't dealt with. Because in the other thing that's happened in the time that you and I have entered the left, and so I got 20 years on you, and so I got 10 years on you, really, as far as entering goes. But like, the difference between our obsession with foreign politics in my 20s, because we were obsessed with domestic relations of foreign politics, which we still are. I mean, and yes, like, if Biden really wanted to, he could probably force Netanyahu down. The problem is that the weakness of the rules-based international order, which is just code for NATO and UN cooperating, is that now there is a small risk that Netanyahu just says no, and then what do? Because it's removed the fig leaf of the international order entirely. It is just a fig leaf because the United States itself, as soon as the Soviet Union was gone, pretty much immediately, by the end of the Yugoslav wars, and the Yugoslav wars were still under international order capacity. I know they didn't go through the UN Security Council exactly, but they still were sanctioned by UN sanction, etc. They went properly, even if we disagree with them, which also tells you the fig leaf of the international order back then. But as soon as it became inconvenient in the Sudanese bombings and some of Clinton's stuff, and definitely during the Bush administration, those are dropped. But again, that's an elite consensus. That isn't just the personality of George Bush. similarly today about elite consensus that I think people have not dealt with, but and this is different than when we talked 2 years ago. The substance of uh, a lot of Bush to Obama to Trump changes, right? That we see reactionary have been maintained by Biden, partly from the vociferousness of opposition and the Biden's willingness and the Democrats' willingness to trade on that, and partly because it's now part of elite consensus as long as it's managed by somebody that people feel like is more stable. Like, and I think that's part of where this electoral weirdness is right now, where both people are very passionate for two candidates that nobody actually really likes. Well, what does the left play in that? Well, the left was not powerful enough to really force Biden's hand or to overtake the Democratic Party. But it was powerful enough, ironically, this was proof of its power, to pick up your thing, to save the Democratic Party from depoliticization. And I actually think in this next election, we're going to see that start to stop. So I think we're going to see, and I don't just think it was because of cold days in Iowa. I think we're going to see decreased voter participation for the first time since the Obama era, which is actually back to a historical norm. But it's been a historical norm that's been off most of my adult life since the second round of the Bush administration. And basically what that means is that the constitutional compromises or whatever, going all the way back to the Bush v. Gore decision, have really come to play. But if you want to see how the left has had an effect, right, Amogh? Like, I listen to elite liberal podcast all the time. They speak our language now. Like, that's something that people don't deal with. They can't, like the fact that, like, the top selling, the top grossing Patreon podcast are leftist ones, sure, but they're also like liberal ones, but they speak the language of the far left, even though they are substantially closer to Biden than anything even the reformists would want. That does indicate that there's been real power, but not enough. What you don't have is a mass movement. You don't have any way to build one either. You have mass discontent. You have mass disformation. Often you have mass popular support for leftist stuff, but it translates not at all to left power. However, the left has enough power to set the terms of elite liberal debate, which does mean it does have power, just not very much.
Yeah, and so that power works against it, right? I'm not saying any of this in an optimistic tone of voice. This is actually horrible. This like middle position between complete irrelevance and complete influence, because it's sucks.
It's a time of monsters, to use Gramscian terms.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this is what you say. It would be better if people didn't listen to you, in terms of the left, in the sense that then some of this strategy would work. Some of this McNair stuff or whatever about like building a base and all of these different things. You would be able to detach yourself from the elite consensus and then do and then like have debates about organization which actually mattered. But now that you're in this feedback loop,
you would seem counter-systemic, right?
Yeah.
Right. We are neither, and the right seems counter-systemic. Although I'm going to say that, like, except for the very, very far right, it isn't. And even the very far right, I mean, one of the ironies of right now is, like, in the left's fight against Alex Jones and their obsession with loons like Alex Jones, they've normalized lunacy like Alex Jones. And I'm not going to say leftists are the only reason that's happened, but like left liberal opposition to people like Alex Jones is why Jimmy Dore and other contrarians will try to pick it up. And while you can hold Dore, and people like that, fairly we can hold Dore accountable for whatever shenanigans he does and like letting Alex Jones falsely clean his record or whatever, and we can call him craven and 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 looch to right wing money or whatever. I don't know. I can't prove some of that. I can prove others of it. I don't think it's actually particularly relevant, though, to be frank. What it shows us is that, at least in the perception of people who used to feel sympathetic to the reformist left, even if they wanted it to be more hostile to the Democrats, and they still have, and you see this from Janet Roy Gray and people downstream, and maybe less cranky than Dorr, that there is a need to be counter-systemic, and the only place they can go is people like Alex Jones. But now Alex Jones's weird patriot conspiracy world is also no longer counter-systemic. It's tied to a real powerful part of the Republican base, and it does have an effect on it. Like, even if, like, from our standpoint, that effect seems completely craven. Like, and in some ways, it is kind of mirror world. Where I talked to a friend of mine where it feels like we're spinning the left and right spin, the far left and the far right spin. It creates a momentum in the center left and the center right, and the center of politics seems to degrade, but it's actually still doing stuff. All right, because these spinning things are creating this feel of movement, but they're not actually affecting that much of the policy here. But they are affecting people's attachment to that policy.
Right.
So people also can't disattach from contemporary politics. I mean, I find that I can't. I still follow the fucking polls.
Sure.
Like, even though, do I care? I mean, people are like, oh, if Trump wins, the Republic is done. I mean, on one hand, okay, there are some states that have been opted in a way that I can see that as a viable argument.
Yep.
On the other hand, I'm also going to say that, like, I've heard that for 20 fucking years. So, like, I don't even know myself which thing I actually believe, because I've heard both for so long. This is a terrible place to be, because it gives me no moral clarity, even from the standpoint of, like, okay, we say we're going to drop the Popular Front. We're going to go back to United Front stance. That's one of my big organizational things. But I have no idea who to form a United Front with. Like, in that, you see that. I think you see that on the left now, because people are searching for counter-systemicness anywhere, and what they're liquidating into is populist nationalism that's losing on, like, capitalist internationalism. I mean, they are losing in that war, but they have more effect than they've had in the past, right? And I say they're losing in it, though, because for all the talk of how Trump was that, and Bannon and his movement in 2016 really was that, they immediately liquidated towards more concessionist stuff as long as they got their tariffs through.
Yeah. This is going to be my biggest hot take ever, but I think I think what all this shows is that American democracy is really healthy and vibrant, and in in the sense that, like,
you're gonna go full anti-Studebaker, okay?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, in a very specific way, that, like, interest group management, like, we're really good at it. The system is, like, very, very, very good at co-opting big interest groups and changing in bits to integrate them. Yeah. It turns out the system can integrate Alex Jones. We wouldn't have thought that. Some people wouldn't have thought that in 2010,
I wouldn't have. No, I would not.
Yeah.
And, apparently Facebook didn't think that either, but now they do. I mean, they haven't undone the ban, but I mean, like, they're also not really, you're not seeing that strategy pursued in the same way.
Right.
And yet, we're still going to hear people both on the right and on the, like, the regressive, the left complaining about the regressive left part of the left, our old friends, who are going to be, like, crowing on about how, like, we have this massive censorship machine in Facebook and Twitter and it's just like, but Twitter's good now because of who runs it or whatever. And I'm just like, you guys are huffing fumes and and not looking at the way power actually works. I actually think maybe you are the dialectical opposite of Studebaker in the true sense, and that you said what he said, but framed it in a way from the standpoint of the powerful, as opposed to standpoint of the semi-powerful.
Right. And both of us have to be sublated. Yeah.
Right. Like, because Studebaker's like, you can't defeat capital flight and U.S. elites, and uh, the right is descending into explicit madness. The left is descending into cope.
Right.
And you're saying like, yeah, and that's proof that American democracy does exactly what the American democracy has been designed to do since at least the 1950s.
Right. In the sense that you can't stop capital flight, but you can annoy the capitalists a whole lot by making capital flight inefficient. And you know, you can stop Jeff Bezos from go whatever headquartering in Queens or whatever. It's this is the annoying thing. No one is happy. No one. And this means that democracy works.
It is something very like, very Thucydidean. It's like, yes, democracy equals stasis. That's what it equals. I don't know why you don't like listen to Plato, for fuck's sake. Like, blah blah blah, iron law of oligarchy, blah blah blah. This is what always happens. And I think that came out more after we quit doing the show. But when I'm like, I want you guys to go back and look, not just at James Burnham. Like, I've been talking about my weird obsession with James Burnham for 20 years. But with Robert Michel's, with the people James Burnham sought, with like the Italian elite school, with the German historical school, there's a reason why I've been trying to get people to look at that. Because these were answers to Marxism that I think were insufficient, but did point out the obvious to me. And to me, there's an almost trans-historical tendency for the real powers in society to blame the middle guy, pretend the middle guy's actually in charge so they can appeal to the other guy to help them overthrow the middle guy that they're both annoyed with, even though their interests aren't really co-aligned together.
Right.
You see that. That's not a capitalist tendency. That's like a structural thing going all the way back to it's a structural thing in hierarchical civilizations. You don't see it in egalitarian ones, but that's because you don't need it. Like, that's one of the things about egalitarian societies that I pointed out that people made people uncomfortable. They're violent. Why are they violent? Because you're equals. Like, and you got to keep it that way. And that's also leads to like provisional hierarchy, but how you decide provisional hierarchy, not always, but often violence. And stuff like that. I like there are trade-offs here that are deeper, right? But yeah, I'm with you on this elite, and I think what that's forced me to do is to try to reconcile my view of the way capitalism works, which is specific and comes out of Marxism, with my view of the way systematic works, which are not trans-historical, but some trends are. Like, it's just like, well, this is something you can see emerge. And what I find interesting in Marxism, and I think this is the reason why we go back to the theory of Bonapartism so much, is the only place Marx really deals with powerful people appealing to marginalized people to beat up on the middle of society and maybe alienate workers who are just slightly above the marginalized. Oh boy.
Brumaire, no? Or maybe not.
Yeah, it's the Brumaire. It's the Brumaire and maybe the civil wars in France. That's it. It's not worked out anywhere else. And so, like, you can kind of see it in the letters on strategy and the way like Marxists are really, like, you can see this in the letters on strategy in so much that Marx is really afraid of socialists doing that they're going to appeal to aristocrats to fight the bourgeoisie in a way that will make them not powerful. It's not actually put in terms of Bonapartism in those letters, although it's very similar. It's put in the critique of Lassalle and Lassalleanism, and actually also some critiques of Liebknecht from Marx himself when he was talking shit about other members. And why they also don't want socialists to do, like, basically what Marx wants socialists to do is what, like, the Freedom Caucus was supposed to do, which is just fuck shit up. That's all it's supposed to do. But the thing is, it assumes a parliamentary system where socialists we're not ever going to be in power electorally. They're going to stop people from being able to administrate power electorally and then take over. That's the military end. Or they'll, Kotsky holds out the idea that maybe you can take it over with like a fail swoop democratic process, go in one vote, get enough majority. But the reason why the Bernsteinian revisionism happens in my mind has a lot to do with the fact that they never got the majorities to do that.
None of that was on the table. None of that
Right.
has ever been on the table. I mean, might be, who knows? But that's, yeah.
Well, I mean, to me, way back when we started the show, I was pondering a question that I kind of wish we got back to, was like, what does it mean that social divisions amongst what we call classes, habitus between classes, in this
Right.
way in which Eric Olin Wright was trying to answer to try back with him. But why is there so much division within the working class if we define the working class as wage laborers?
Right.
Now, I think Eric Olin Wright actually hurts his argument because he throws out labor theory of value because he's a analytic Marxist and does that almost dogmatically. But he's got a point that there's alienation from interclass competition that actually creates what stratas of classes. I know that people like Kat from Lou don't like to talk about strata because I guess they find it anesthetic.
Yeah.
But that in a real sense that like, well, they're still workers, but you have, are there petit bourgeois? Are there bourgeois? Are there outside of the system, peasant, lumpen, whatever?
Yeah.
But the great majority of the population now, about 80% of it, is in predominantly wage relations. And even a lot of the people who aren't in wage relations look like they're in wage relations. Like, you have to really look at their benefits to see that their actual pay is in stock options, which is ownership.
Yeah.
In structuralized forms of capital. But if you're not among that group of people, you are dependent on a general welfare fund, and unless you work for the state, which puts you in a weird category according to Marx that he can't really even figure out, you're a worker in some sense. Now, why has it become so stratified? And I guess my point about why this doesn't happen, why this unify, is new divisions start to emerge that are serious, real, substantive, and not just a blinkered ideology or lack
Right.
of class consciousness.
I mean, put the question the other way. Why wouldn't it be stratified? What's the expectation the other way? And because, well, we have this thing that, when more and more people become proletarianized, somehow they magically gain, they get immiserated. Maybe, no, we don't think that anymore. But
Right.
or they maybe gain the ability to run the system because the way capitalist development works, it relies on blah blah blah, and eventually, Workers' Party.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's interesting to me because I was reading On Authority and I realized that's not the best thing to read from Engels, and that was part of my point. But Engels just assumes that everything in that text, even though Capital itself, Capital Volume 1 and 2 actually makes this clear that this is not possible. And I don't mean in the like Kohei Sato, like secretly it was all about soil erosion the whole time sense. I mean in the like there's a contradiction in the centralization that also leads to fragmentation simultaneously.
Right.
Marx acknowledges that,
Yeah.
right? And in times Engels acknowledges it, but he doesn't acknowledge it when he's really annoyed at anarchists at the end of the Second International, apparently. And you just see this kind of Whiggish like view of centralization. But what I realized is a lot of Marxists, including Marx and Engels sometimes, do actually fall prey to that, where they're just like, oh, this is going to centralize forever. And that's how all we have to do then is like get rid of the minority it's in control of it and flip the switch.
Yeah.
That's literally what they think. I mean, like, and Marx and Engels kind of, in their more theoretically rigorous work, realize that they can't really do that, but that they default to that a whole lot. Now, what makes that interesting to me is that means like if you universalize the working class, well, what's going to happen? It's going to subdivide amongst itself. So that's the I talk about the rational core of these incoherent class theses. Like to me, PMC it's not a class thesis. Like what consistent role of production or relationship to capital or even like income strata does it have? None. It has a certain curtailing effect. That's it. And you can find that curtailing effect in non-PNC positions. It's just done through different things like licensure or guild unions, etc. The other thing you have to realize is for all that we hate guild unions, they're actually super effective. They've survived, and the industrial unions haven't. I mean, they've had, but in some ways you could argue that the industrial unions have survived by acting like guild unions. It's not like the UAW is trying to organize all the auto industry, including franchises downstream. Right?
Yep.
Like, they're just trying to organize a factory. And since the factory now is so small, it's such a small part of production that it effectively does operate like a guild. So, and I think that's going to make people really uncomfortable to like deal with. But there's this way in which your thesis seems to be that like leftists are in denial of their own power because they're in a center position. That center position is actually really painful to look at, honestly.
Yeah.
Because it does make you culpable for part of what is happening.
Yeah.
But not powerful enough to truly reverse it and get what you want. So you want to simultaneously say, we're not culpable for any of this. We're not participating in it. We're losers, but also we're winners secretly this whole time.
Yeah.
But we should know from like when Christians tried this shit in the 1980s, like in the silent majority times, that's a stupid strategy. It's just it's self-dishonest in a way that actually will eventually lead you to not having power at all.
Right.
Like
this is a bit of a digression, but I want to universalize that this like disavowing your own culpability. I think that's true of the liberals and the right as well. That everyone thinks they're secretly losers, but they all have culpability. I mean, not to the same extent. But like, everyone sounds like they're whining about politics now, about like, the right is oh, we live in this hellscape of, cultural liberalism, and liberals are like extremes, populism. Wow, what's going on? We don't have control. It's, but yeah, I mean, that's just an aside.
Well, that's when I interjected Joseph Tainter after we quit doing the shows. I was like, maybe things are too complicated for anyone to feel like they could possibly win this. And they're not looking at the reality is that no one's in control anymore because no one can be.
Right.
Like it's too complicated for you, which makes this is kind of left exceptionalist in a way that I think should make people uncomfortable. It doesn't put the left in a particularly delusional relationship because most of our strategies, MMT is a strategy in management. Marxist-Leninism is actually a strategy in management. I know people don't like that, but it's true.
Yeah.
Like, their obsession with like Prussian Central Command, which by the way, isn't even that militarily effective, but whatever.
Famously won World War I anyway.
But their obsession with this, that's a mode of management, not even really a mode of production. The great debates between Marxists before then was basically, do you try to have a bourgeois and socialist revolution kind of simultaneously? Do you do that democratically, a la the SPD and the Second International?
Right.
That was the Socialist Labor Party's critique of them, is like you were trying to confuse a bourgeois revolution and a socialist revolution. Do you go the Leninist route and say, oh no, we have the socialist revolution because we have the peasants on our side to do that, although we don't for very long, or the Red Terror wouldn't have been necessary. So then we do it that way. Is that how we do it? Or is there this other thing that we have to do, which is this Lenin, is to do capitalism ourselves, kind of what Plekhanov was losing sleep about. So what do we do?
Yeah, it's this tricky position where, in terms of like, if we're doing the usual Marxist being and consciousness, social being, it's actually not super hard to explain. A bunch of the, like, in terms of the objective balance of forces, yeah, I mean, I'm with you on the, like, use a bit of Burnham, use a bit of Weber, some kind of Marx-Weber synthesis, does quite well in just explaining stasis. That actually is not super hard to explain. We've been doing it for a while. The harder thing to explain is why, consciousness in all sides just seems to be completely ignorant of the underlying stasis. Like it always wants to look away from it on all sides. I mean, we're talking about the left, right? But on the left,
Mm-hmm.
it's like there is a structural tendency to not want to pay attention to your like culpability and integration in the system, right? And that's why the dialectic doesn't get started. That's why, because you can't, because that's the way, by the way, that's the way the dialectic is supposed to work, right? Like consciousness adjusts to being, which changes being, which changes consciousness, but we don't have that. Consciousness and being are just apart. How you interpret the world and what there is just, they aren't coming into contact. Theory and practice are just fucking separate. And yeah, because it's too hard. I mean, the reason, by the way, I mean, I don't completely disagree with the Studebaker thing, and I sort of have put things in a sort of optimistic way because that's the harder thing to hear, right? Like the Studebaker thing is in a way the easier to hear from a left perspective because you fucking think everything's falling apart anyway, right? So it's like Studebaker tells you that it's what's harder to hear is that like I mean, not that I think everything's not falling apart, but like fuck it, I'll say that. Let me say that like things are not falling apart in quite the way you think they are. And it's very, very hard to look at that. It's very hard to look at that. But I think the place to start has got to, the thing we have got to stop doing is to pretend there's some outside to all of this craziness that we can occupy and build from. Right? There's some like pure outside, right? And it's hard. I don't know. I don't know how you do that, but that's got to be the first step to try to like to have some kind of amor fati, to have some kind of fucking sense of like, we're all stuck in this mess, and there's no there's no social outside this political that we can kind of run to, right? So sorry, anti-politics people.
Well, I mean, they've kind of gone away, if it makes
sense. Yeah.
I mean, there are still a few people trying to discuss it, but the idea that you could construe, the idea that you construe the political away from the economic or the economic away from the political, which leads to the false binary of political determinism and economism, is also predicated by the false binary between the social and the political. Like that's not those right. Binaries are not real. Right. Like legal informed relations of production and all that actually do inform the other way around, and you wants to make it soft and squishy so that you can separate it out are foolish.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, like to phrase it optimistically is to say like I've been kind of doing this a while. I've been talking about Hudson, and I've been picking on Hudson a little bit. Hudson's a very smart guy. I actually take his analysis quite seriously. But there's a way in which, like, he's been predicting the fall of the U.S. for 20 years. And the Peter Zions of the world have been telling you, look, yes, globalization is ending. You're right. But that doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean that elite consensus falls apart anywhere, actually. And oddly, good ship North America is in a better place to deal with it, just materially speaking. Our problems are our own political incoherence, and our own social malaise, which are real problems.
But also not as it's not as unique as we think they are. Everywhere's politically incoherent. Everywhere has social problems.
Well, this came up in my discussion with on Climate Leviathan, which a lot of people have, people really love. Now they hate it. You know how it goes. But the Climate Leviathan guy pointed out that Trump was actually a manifestation of stuff that had been happening in Europe and Asia for like 10 years that, it was just came late to the United States. The United States was exceptional in that it was late to actually deal with the end of its form of politics. But when it happened, you still hear people like, oh, well, you can't have the Republican Party of 2012. I mean, as if, 2012 is more than 10 years ago, but like in the long array of things, that's not that long. Like, and it actually is similar to the way after Goldwater, you can't have Eisenhower's Republican Party.
Yeah.
But what does that mean? We don't know. All right. Because on one hand, Trumpism is counter-systemic. On the other hand, it's not. I mean, that's the dialectic of Trumpism. Like, if you actually listen to like Trump's caveats on things like abortion or dictatorship or whatever, he's a he's a moderate when he needs to be a moderate, when that's in line with his base. He's lizard brain on that stuff. He is truly a demagogue in that sense.
See,
But
democracy works.
right, but also, in some ways, so is Biden.
Right.
Like Biden's like, we're going to return the normalcy. That's what Democrats wanted to hear. Everyone knows that was not possible.
Right.
But that's what Democrats wanted to hear. It was weirdly like the Democrats trying to do the Morning in America thing. Like, except that's real hard to do from their perspective. And it's real hard to do when you haven't figured out a way to reset the economy, even though the economy is not doing as bad as you think it is. And no, it's not, but it is stagnant for most people.
Right.
And honestly, the people that it's doing pretty good for are the very poor and the upper middle class, which lo and behold, I wonder who that's the base of what party that is.
Yep. And by the way, I'm not, I won't go so far as to say that that's a left win, but like, the child tax credit and a bunch of stuff that like lifted the incomes of the very poor, like that's for sure a reflection of the, that wouldn't have happened that wouldn't have been as big as it was if the DSA and Bernie weren't part of the coalition.
Right.
That's
but also it proves how limited it is, because that's already gone, and it's not
exactly. That was 1 year. Right. The Biden LBJ comparison is unfair to LBJ.
Right. Well, people always like, Biden's the most progressive president since FDR, and I'm like, one, FDR wasn't that progressive. Two, LBJ, quit doing LBJ eraser because you didn't like his foreign policy. You're not going to like Biden's either. Ha ha! Now we're there. It just took you 3 years to really for it to really sink in.
Right.
So it's just like, and hey, never mind. I'm not going to say that. That's too dark. I mean, I think.
But yeah, he's saying morning in America. It's weird. It's like his message is morning in America, and it looks one shade leftier than it used to before the crash. That's like, that's his thing. Because it's like job recovery with more unions, with more inequality, less inequality, blah blah blah, all this kind of stuff. So it's like, sad thing is, you believe it or not, left, the system is trying to give you what it thinks you want.
Right. The thing is that it can't, and you don't know what you want.
Right. Exactly.
Like,
because you asked a lot of like reformists, and they would have settled for the, in 2008. In 2009, this is all the stuff they wanted Obama to do. They wanted a bigger stimulus. They wanted more explicit support for union stuff. Biden went on a fucking picket line. Now, I'm not going to say, whatever, but like, a lot of reformists would have been very happy with all this. And I would say they still are.
My pickup on that would be, in a way that should probably make the left uncomfortable. Who else did the same thing? I mean, Trump has more anti-union rhetoric because of the incoherence of his coalition. One of the ironies, and I fucking hate that I got this from Nate fucking Silver.
While he was in Vegas doing whatever the fuck he does now.
Right. Gambling, which is what he does with politics too. But he said something offhand is like, well, the Republican Party, for all its it's emotional venomance, after Trump, is actually a coalitionary party. That, like, yeah, it's one idea. It's like a coalition of groups, rumpist elements of labor, rumpist elements of petite bourgeois, Sunbelt businesses, the better business community, a small part of the frustrated part of the defense mechanism. Usually, it's actually tied into Homeland Security and not into the military.
Right.
Like that's their coalition. It's actually a very small coalition, one that is going to be less white though, which is something that's going to drive Democrats up the wall because that story didn't work out for them either. You know, in a way, that's the irony of success. If you start like normalizing groups' ability to integrate into the United States, they're going to start looking and acting like other groups in the United States, like.
Reminds me of D'Souza. D'Souza ends one of his films with like, you know you've become an American when you become a Republican.
And so I'm just like, are you surprised, right? That like that's what would happen.
Right.
That you do you really have the? I mean, one of the things that's ironic about the left and the Democrats. I mean, Democrats don't operate off a theory of Bonapartism because they're in power. They don't have to operate off a theory of anything, but the left does. But the left can't like see the like blatant Bonapartist logic about its own relationship to sub-demographic groups. And then I'm like, well, but what happens when you succeed? You're going to divide like the divisions of which are elided now, you know, which you can flatten out in like this racial, you get rid of you actually start seceding on racial grounds, and other divisions which are deeper come up. Like, what do you expect? From a basic sociological calculus, that's what's going to happen. And yet, like, everything was always like, we're going to like rule. It's going to be progressive forever because of demography and youth people. And I was like, well, why do you think, I mean, the baby boomers didn't start out.
Wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. The baby boomers didn't start out as centrist either.
Right.
Like, you know, I mean, actually, the irony of theirs, they actually started out as conservatives, but most people don't know that. They buy a false narrative about what the baby boomers were.
Yeah, the new left was like a bunch of people. They were older than boomers, right?
Yeah, they were silent generation, and they were tiny. Like that's the thing. Like they were a tiny generation. You know, and yeah, I mean. I guess you and I are actually like we're being meta doomers in a way because I'm framing this optimistically. It's like, aha, you think you get out of it with your doom.
You don't. Yeah,
you don't. And
you and Ezra Klein are in the same system. You and Ezra Klein are the elite consensus is all of us, and that's horrible.
Right. It's all of us from a spectrum of Alex Jones and Greg Greenwald all the way over to Rachel Maddow, and we are somewhere in that mix.
Yeah. Derek Varn and Joe Biden are, hand in hand, part of the American
land. Well, the other thing that this was one of my frustrations. The other thing that happened during our tenure was me getting more. I've been told I've been moved to the right. I don't think I have, but I got more and more frustrated with the language of left communism because it was consciously positing what I considered to be like an idealist. And I don't mean this in the insult. I mean this literally, like an idea of something in the world of which, doesn't exist anymore. So, for example, the left of capitalism, when you also say that everything is capitalist, well, then that's just the left. And you're like, oh, well, I'm not part of the left. I'm part of this other thing. What other thing? What system are you actually participating in by being outside of the left of capital when you also don't think that even China is outside of capitalism? Meaning that you are the left in ideal form, like of some kind of platonic form of the left that does not actually exist and act in the world. Right. Maybe you want it to be, but it isn't. And framing it as if you exist as a left that exists right now as an alternative to the left of capital, because there's 5 of you in some sect somewhere, is fundamentally self-dishonest in a way that makes you unable to actually do any kind of left communist intervention because it's so clear that you're part of something that isn't.
Right.
Right. Like, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how exactly to remedy that, but one starting point that sounds not crazy is, okay, why don't you, let's assume the worst. We are the left of capital. What now?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
What
Like,
now?
what are you going to do to convince the left of capital to be whatever you want it to be? Oh, you're not. You're going to convince the workers. Well, I can tell you, there's less of the workers who are part of what you are than a part of the left of capital. Even though
Right?
you're like, well, the workers are depoliticized. Absolutely, they are. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And honestly, in so much as they are politicized, they're probably politicized reactionary because you can stop something easier than you can build something.
Right.
Um,
When workers are not depoliticized doesn't mean you can do an end run around the political system. Because, by the way, this is the scariest fucking shit I heard. I was reading Jonah Goldberg of all people. Anyway, this is a much longer conversation, but I'll leave that there. And he was talking about how, like, both political parties are really idealist about people who don't turn out. They're like, the assumption is always, oh my God, elections would totally change if voter turnout was like way much higher, right? And like the scary thought is that they wouldn't. That you just, the people who didn't turn out were just divided in the same way as the existing electorate. Now, I don't think that's true, but it's like, I think it's something worth thinking about, that like maybe there isn't this outside of politics that's going to massively swing things one way or another.
yeah. Oh man.
Because what do
So
we know about people who don't vote? We know, like, how are we so sure that they're going to vote for PSL or whatever, or even that they're going to vote for fascism?
well, I mean, what it does allow, and this is the sense in which I guess the Overton window is both true and false simultaneously. Um, is the rhetoric shift does matter. Like, it does actually matter that Trump talks in a different way and that AOC talks in a different way. And yet, it doesn't actually change the horizons of possibility that much. What it changes is your possible contextual understanding of the horizons of possibility. But the irony is this entire time. I mean, the irony of the 21st century and of the end of the 20th century, um, that I don't see leftists deal with again, is that political polarization is more and more endemic across the spectrum, but also elite consensus is actually pretty damn tight. They want you to think that you're fighting over big things over small things, and you're like, who are they? Well, I mean, honestly, like, whoever's running structural capitalism is very happy with you thinking that, like, things that really matter on margin, and the thing is they do change people's lives on margin. They do. Like the reversal of Roe v. Wade makes life very harder for people in about 40% of the states.
Right.
Um, uh, but what it doesn't do is it's not going to lead to if it really was going to change stuff substantively, we'd see a population boom. We aren't going
Right.
to see a population boom from the end of abortion. Does that mean it's not bad? It absolutely is bad. I don't want to demean what that means, but that's the biggest change in American life I can think of. And what I've tried to point out to people, that's a systemic compromise that is good for both sides, because the conservatives can continue to try to push a national ban, which some of them are sincere about, but they're not going to get through. And the liberals now have a way to motivate people to act in red states that they didn't have before.
Yeah.
Why would they fix that? Like, that is like, it's just like, it's the same reason why the conservatives have never really tried to actually, when they were in power, not through judicial fiat, to force a confirmation by nationally banning abortion in a way that was significant. Why? Because it would actually undo one of the few motivating factors that got their evangelical base to stay loyal to them. Right? Now, let's put this in the context of production. All right. None of this matters that much for production. The places where abortion is going to be banned are places, with the exception of the West, like Utah and well, not Colorado, but Utah and a few other places, are places with dying off and declining populations. Like, it's almost projection. Um, for women who are victimized, it's going to be a nightmare, right? But in aggregate, um, it actually it's interesting how like it's not like you're not seeing Zoomers becoming like into tradcaf lifestyles or all becoming Andrew Tate. You're just not. That's not happening. And the question is, why? If this policy really did change American life that deeply, similarly, like you know, the minimum wage is now something that no one actually even gets. Because you're gonna have more and more uneducated labor, blah blah blah. So like there's real competition in the bottom part of the sector that actually is eating out the lower middle of the sector of workers' income sector. It is. It's actually weakening. They're the people getting hurt the most by inflation. Because their wages have not gone up with inflation quite as much as the low end of the sector are as professionals. Like those, like it's just not happening. The left has nothing to speak to that. I mean, and weirdly, that is the area where you're like, you know, if you talk about like blue collar workers, that's who you're talking about. The other thing that the left can't really deal with is it wants to be anti-productivist for good reasons. I'm not even denying that. But then it wants to be like, everyone's going to have good, clean jobs. Well, they would for a little while, unless you actually like really take over the state, but you don't have the capacity to do that. So what are you actually saying? So we're going to like get some good, clean jobs for like 10 years and we'll figure it out later? That's what led to the healthcare debacle. And one of the reasons why we can't fix the healthcare, this is my hot take. I've said it now for 10 years, but I think it's true. One of the reasons why the United States in particular can't fix the healthcare debacle is not just that you have an entire urban industry that would collapse if you actually fix the problem. And it is one of the ways people get out of deindustrialized workspaces other than the military. And the military doesn't need them anymore. You don't need the poverty draft anymore. You got drones for that. Like unskilled combat is about as useful as unskilled labor. And we can romanticize people who make it skilled, and there are people who are good at combat who can outdo a drone, sure, but in aggregate, the drones are more useful.
Or more efficient. I mean, it doesn't even matter more useful, just, you know, it's capitalism we're talking about. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, when you shoot a drone, you can repair it.
Yeah.
When you shoot a person, maybe they get repaired, maybe they don't. I mean, you think about that, and that's just from the standpoint of treating a person like a cog in the machine.
Sure.
So these are things to think about. The left really has not, and I guess this leads me to the last question. We've been talking for a while. I think we're going to have a couple of these conversations, Amogh.
Good.
I've been wanting to have you back on for a while because you started this long journey with me more sunny and bright-eyed than I was, and you were like, Varn, you were too negative. And now I think you may be the darker-minded of us.
From a left point of view, sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, well, I mean, ironically, you're like, there's no social world. Also, you know, politics is actually working as it's designed to, which is sort of been my implication of a lot of my talks about. I'm no longer quite as big on cybernetics. I see problems with it, but like, a system is what it does, not what you want it to do.
Right.
And I'm like, well, the system's doing what it's been doing for and surviving pretty damn good, actually. And it's had plenty of chances to crash. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to last forever, but what's surprising is like, I mean, this might be called the long strange death of America, is that it's not totally dying even as it's declining. It's just like, you know, gleefully going into its donage with pretty good provisions. And that the left can't handle that. I don't know, and that seems to be partly systemic, and it doesn't seem to just be about the left either. Like the right can't. I mean, I think the right's going to get weirder and weirder and weirder because it has less sophisticated ways to adjudicate things that can't make work, and so it's uh, and also there's a larger division of like leftists for all their elitist impulse have an egalitarian impulse in that like we think anyone can learn our weird jargon and be part of the game if
Right.
like uh elite conservatives do not think unelite conservatives can even be elite conservatives. They think that we need our idiot shock troops and like we'll be the secret masters behind the scenes, which is also
Right.
why by the way, when people go, why don't we see conservative intellectuals? Why would they want you to see them?
Right.
Like,
You hide out in Claremont doing whatever the fuck.
yeah, like exactly. Like that their theory of how power works is not based on you knowing, aren't even their own people knowing who they are. Like,
Right.
like, come on.
Right. I mean, another thing to draw out, by the way, of the point of this optimism, this often means that left organizing efforts on the ground will go quite far. So it doesn't even help you to be a doomer on the ground, right? This means there's like a systematic disconnect between the on the ground local organizing perspective and like global stasis. And that's why like the machine's going to keep wearing on,
Right, and that's also why you have these flip-flops between localism and nationalism,
Exactly.
localism, nationalism,
Exactly.
horizonalism, verticalism, is because actually there's a stasis that neither one of those things can get around.
Right.
And as long as you're playing those games, you can have an effect on that
Yeah.
stasis. You can,
Yeah.
and you are actually.
Yeah.
But what you can't do is actually take control of the totality at all.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
And in
And
fact,
then there's this weird realism that people end up in, which is like this stasis is like, is this real politics? And then,
yeah,
but
well,
yeah,
politics becomes something. I mean, this is the theoretical construct. This politics becomes something else. Modernity becomes either the same as or so fundamentally different from the ancient world that we can't talk about
right.
any continuity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, this is Weber's the long hard boring of hard boards or whatever.
Right.
Except it's the what that looks like now is like a million stupid debates on X or whatever the fuck. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess my last question, though, we've talked a lot about the left in specific. We've kind of dipped into specific left wing tendencies. We'll probably go into this in a conversation in a month or so, talking about what we've seen in these tendencies. Because I have a feeling this reunion about 10 years of us working together and ranting about this is gonna is also probably going to alienate a lot of people, but it is we have a lot to talk about because a whole lot has changed and a whole lot of meta stuff has stayed the same. I mean, and I mean that even in like fundamentals of the economy have changed, and yet like some basic capitalist dynamics have not changed.
Right.
I mean, that's why I was so mad at the the techno neo-feudalism and the capitalism thesis. That's even to me even like more problematic than the monopoly capital thesis was. It's like, oh, so we can fight this other thing as opposed to capitalism changing.
Right. Right.
Like if we're not fighting neoliberalism, we have to be fighting something fundamentally older and like some regressive core. And I'm sort of like, yeah, but like pixels don't farm food. Like the internet actually requires physical infrastructure, physical materials, and all that. It's not like you can go into cyberspace without energy inputs and physical infrastructure anyway.
Right.
So like,
but that doesn't mean the internet doesn't change anything. We're not saying that.
No, we're not. It changes a ton, but like, it creates new RNTA opportunities. It creates all kinds of stuff. But at the same token, like, weirdly, if the techno neo-feudalism thing was serious, then like AI would have been a bigger threat to the economy than it's actually ended up being so far.
Right.
And and then like I don't know, Eritrea could do MNT policy on its own. Because the physical barriers would be gone. Um, and so
PT, MMT, that's where we're going.
my thing is like, my last question, I guess, was a question I hinted at in the beginning, is you came out of one milieu, you ended up in another. But looking back at the milieu you came out of, the kind of heterodox economic policy sphere, it seems in total disarray. I mean, like, now you have MMT Stalinist and MMT nationalist and like MMT anarchist, like people who believe fundamentally contradictory things, but also somehow believe in a chartalist theory of the state. Like, you have increasing insistence that economies are autarkic, even though like we're really watching in real time attempts to make economies autarkic aren't working. You know, they're not truly self-contained like that, and they never, like, you're not in a closed system with tokens, like, and so that realization seems to have driven some people into incoherence, and these people who in 2019 and 2020 seem like they were literally about to take over like the economic discussion of both parties in some ways.
Right.
And they seem so utterly beaten back now. Even though, like, I'll give them some defense. Not everything they've said even been disproven. It's just like they were not prepared for the moment at hand, even when they have a theory for it. Although increasingly, when I read them, they feel their theories feel really ad hoc, and they're kind of in denial about that.
Right.
But heterodox economics, I mean, even what modern monetary theory is, like, yes, Randall Way and stuff have been around for a long time. Some of the stuff like Lerner goes back to the 60s. Freddie Lee goes back a long time too. But like, when we entered this, that was Minsky and post-Minskyites, and then like by 2019, that was like neo-chartalism, and we're not dealing with Minsky and Keynes anymore, and then there was this conflation of like Marcel Mauss and David Graeber theories of societal money that became theories of state money, as if they were the same thing.
That's fucking that guy. Are you talking about like the gifted, like Charles Eisenstein, like that guy? The guy's he's a RFK guy now. He fucking introduced.
Well, I'm just saying, like, their politics, they've gone from like almost tasting what they thought was real power to being just as discombobulated as the Marxist in the 60s, right? Why? What is your experience of that as someone who comes out of that world more than me?
I think it's split. It was always like a coalition of a bunch of things, right? It was like, you know, it was a bunch of like, how to put this? So Liz Warren was a part of the Heterodox Economics Coalition, right? And originally, all the way back in 2007 or whatever, right? And it was a coalition of kind of like, you know, people, academics, and so on the edge of the Democratic Party with other weird heterodox economics academics, people from different groups, you know. Some people who called themselves Marxists, like Duncan Foley and Anwar Sheikh, we would have thought of as back then as like heterodox economics in some way, you know, because they didn't have. I mean, they may have had party affiliations back in the day, but they didn't have them, you know, in the 2000s. So they just got lumped in, right? And then a division happened. The kind of weird MMT savant types, I think they went in the direction that you were talking about. A bunch of the sort of academics and policy people, they just went into the Biden administration, right? So the FTC, the anti-monopoly FTC, that's happening based on quotes unquote heterodox ideas about monopoly and whatever, you know. It's like the stuff about, you know, there's that Michael Pettis, you know, and Matt Klein, trade wars as class wars. Like that shapes the way like liberals around the Biden administration think about China, right? You know, so the wing that I'm most familiar with in New York are people who have gone straight from the fringes during the financial crisis to the center of the Democratic policy debate, and who is shaping kind of like Biden's like I don't know what to call it, like neo-mercantilist, decoupling, whatever it is, right? That's heterodox econ, or one bit of it anyway. The people you're talking about are kind of like, they were part of the coalition, but now they've split off into fucking what I see as Twitter weirdness and craziness. They have no effect. But like the more like the lawyers, the policy journalists, the economists, a lot of them are just like, they're libs now. They're mainstream libs now, and they've been integrated. That's what's happened to heterodox economics.
Which is what happened to Keynesianism too, really.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly the same process. And strangely enough,
it maybe happened to Marxists too.
Well, the thing about the heterodox econ who got integrated is that they think about things not a million miles away from you and I, in the sense of, like, what is the world? The world is this like big power contest between groups, between like big states, and like, basically, how do states win the global war? They do developmentalism or whatever, and it's this kind of like Bonapartism as like economic, positive economic policy, rather than
right. It is it's a concession to political reality for a kind of economic reality, but they can't do the kinds of things that the far end of MMT promised they would do, whether it's the Moslerites or the Tankesites or whoever, are because you're not going to get a jobs guarantee. As I pointed out, that affects power dynamics too much, and they know that. If you start doing that kind of stuff, it's actually going to divide the nation, and they're afraid of the decline of national competition,
right?
Et cetera, et cetera. So, like, they have a very corporatist policy. Now, I don't say this to say that MMTers are fascist. That was young me. That's not me now.
Because they're not, and
they're not. No. But they are corporatists.
Yeah.
In the same way that fascists were corporatists. Right. Their means of managing, to bring it back to your point about management, their means of managing society, as opposed to, I don't know, vitalist terror and racial purification, are authoritarian, are in classical fascism, which is very different than Hitlerism anyway.
Right.
Are in integral state theories that makes the state manifested in a leader, a singular leader, almost like a king, but popularly elected. So blah, blah, blah. These kind of corporatist schemas aren't going to work for them. So they're not the same. But like from the Marxist position, what they're trying to do actually is kind of the same, which is like manage capital, which is an international force that has to be managed nationally, and deal in trade-off between sectors of capital, some of which are going to be more internationally oriented and going to be a problem for you. Some are going to be more nationally oriented and going to be a problem for you. And they also want to do what the old fascists did in this other sense too, is they want to manage leftist orientations and rightist orientations while keeping them in the system and not leading to massive social fragmentation and dysfunction.
Right.
But a lot of everyone's discovered that that like fundamental polarization within the society actually seems to keep people invested in politics.
Right.
At least a certain class of people. Although I will say it seems to be a high risk strategy that is beginning to exhaust people in a way. Like people who think like we're going to have 2016 era anti-Trumpism. I think they're just wrong. I think I could be wrong about that, but I think a general society is exhausted by all that now, and it's not going to be able to run it up a second time in the same way. It's not that we won't see opposition; we'll see a lot of it,
right?
But
to say a quick thing about the heterodox econ people, their bet, the sort of smarter ones in around the sort of around Biden, is that what they're trying to do is they're trying to ride the tiger of all of these dynamics just long enough to keep the Democratic coalition together, to piecemeal reform their way to some of what the MMT people want. Now, that obviously is shitty in a bunch of different ways, but that is actually doing politics. That's engaging with some of the global dynamics there are to get what you want, or some of what you want, right? So yeah, I've become a lib now. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is you gotta work for the office of management and budget. That's where all the communists have to go. No, anyway, this is not an endorsement. I'm just saying that like this is the reason people gravitate to this stuff, because this is like the kind of impact that people think you can have. You ride the tiger. If you just put the right sanctions regime and the right tariff regime, you can get just enough jobs in swing states to get that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're more black pilled than me.
No. I'm not saying this is the only way. I'm just, it's just like this. There's a reason that a bunch of people who started out on the left are now trying to pull this shit in the White House. It's just that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
There's always a reason for it. Like
no.
This is why the anarchist and left communist and even like certain elements of old Marxists have always been like, you have to be careful with this. If you're going to engage in it, you have to engage in it only negatively.
Right.
Because the moment you start trying to trade off politics of it, you're actually granting it legitimacy.
Sure.
Right. But the way that the reformists can respond back to that, and this is a fair response. I want to tell people this is a fair response. I don't like it, but it's fair. What have you done with your dual power institutions that want to work outside of it? We do see those exist in the world. They exist in places like Lebanon.
Right.
Like they're real, but you can't build them. And when they do build, it's because the center has screwed up so completely that both government and civil society have basically fallen apart, and you have stepped into the gap. But that leads to that's actually the kind of elephant in the room of the problem of Marxism right now.
Right.
Is like, that's going to lead that you always going to the most marginal places with the least effect that are going to need the most help, and saying that that's going to be the people who solve everything for everybody.
Right.
Which doesn't make sense.
Right. Like, and the strange thing is that the reformists only get their momentum from revolutionaries doing things on the ground. That's the fucking strange codependency that like, and people, some people, that some of the Jacobin people think this is a good thing, that this is like a broad front or whatever, that like, it's, what was that Atlantic piece? Biden's coalition, Bill Kristol and Angela Davis, right. And this is the thing, it's like, it's kind of true that like the reformists don't get any space without any, grassroots action that is not driven by them. They do not drive grassroots mobilization. The people who drive grassroots mobilization are, I was about to say the people who listen to this, but probably not actually. But
no, my people don't. I mean, my people organize and are often in unions, but they're not like out. They don't usually do that kind of organizing.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, grassroots mobilization. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to deal with is the fundamental change of what grassroots is now that media organizations have changed, and that also seems to bother people because everyone wants to say the internet's not real, and in some sense they're right. They're right, but in another sense, but that's where all the dialogue happens, so that's where your access is. And if you think you're gonna like build it through local newspapers, you're fucking deluded. Or even through like the DSA Let's Canvas Forever, because you're going to run out of money, which by the way, they are.
Yeah.
Or you're going to exhaust unless you have a truly mass movement behind you and multiple organizations doing it, you're going to exhaust your membership base, which they apparently are. Right. So, that's where you're at. And so you are kind of based with, I guess the same reason I talked to Studebaker, maybe your maligned optimism and Studebaker's hopeful despair or whatever can both get us into thinking about like, what does it mean to truly stand independent of that? And when also realizing that in some way you'll never stand completely independent of it for the reasons like we said before, like, you exist in a totality in that sense. You're not going to like, we live in a society. That's a very real thing. You can't just pretend that you don't. So in that sense, you do have to work with what you're given. This is why I'm like not arguing that everyone needs to rebuild every union from the ground up.
Right.
But on the same token, you got to realize what you're doing and you got to have an orientation that's not just about immediate concessions, because you're going to get into these problems almost immediately. Because
Right.
what's going to happen to these MMTers when Biden goes down, which looks
Yeah.
increasingly likely?
Yeah. They're going to become Democratic Party hacks, and they're going to, it's absolutely.
And they're going to be on the losing end of being Democratic Party hacks too.
Oh,
They're going to be
absolutely.
the
Yeah.
old hacks that were discredited.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is the tricky thing. I haven't said this as well as I could, but the thing is that we have to think within the system, not independently of the system, but outside of all the existing subject positions. We can't think, this we can't think in terms of this reformist way of reformist approach. We also can't think in terms of this revolutionary approach. These are all poles within the system that just reproduce things. It's like, it's a strange kind of thought position. It's like, we're not independent of all these dynamics, but we also can't play the role we're given. And so it's weird. I I can just gesture at it barely.
All right. Well, we'll probably have you come back on in a month, because there's so much to talk about. We haven't even gotten into the specific tendencies we've seen emerge. We haven't gotten into why our concerns have changed. And I'm not sure yours and mine are in the same spot. You're deeper in academia. I'm deeper and deeper in bureaucratic teacher life. We are both in the United States, which we were not when we started, neither one of us.
Yeah.
You happen to not been born in this accursed land, and I happen to have been born in this accursed land, but that doesn't really change. We were both actually abroad when we started, and I do think that may change. Like, I find that my attitude and fear of certain left-wing tendencies that used to really bother me, these cultural left-wing tendencies that I found really annoying, like when I'm actually here, I'm just like, well, that's ineffective, and it does have effect on larger culture. I'm not denying that. But this idea that it's like, I recently read something at Sublation that basically implied that it was like an equivalency to communist conspiracy, and that we should be like Norman Thomas in the socialist movement and oppose the conspirators and fighting intersectionality. And I'm like, like that's like a 10 years ago fight anyway. Like their victory was also their defeat, as so many things are in this system. And B, how powerful do you think they are, and how powerful do you think you are? Like, some of these things come from trends like that are going to change. I mean, one of the ironies is that over and over again, left-wing critiques of left-wing stuff are minority critiques of stuff or whatever, like woke, shifts into debate into where it's used nebulously by the opposition, and this happens over and over and over again, going all the way back to like the fucking Birchers. The Birchers were both conspirators, literally, and conspiracy minded. And they often used Lenin cells and Leninist logic to also then find Leninism everywhere and fight it, this and the other. And they justified that fight off of the conspiracism of the other side. But what that is a mutually enforcing feedback loop that can't be disproven. Like the radical left is motivated by the radical right and vice versa. Like, there is one of the, for all of Crispin's millenarianism, and I tend to like, of the Chapo boys and Amber, the one I've always kind of respected Crispin, but there is kind of a prophetic / millenarian element to him, and like, he's aware of it, but it is sort of like, I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, your view of mass movements, like, kind of almost sounds like eschatology to me. But because he is one of the people who does the left has lost, politics is always something else than what we're doing. Like,
right.
Like, and I'll admit, for the reasons why you say, I've done that in the past too, because it's appealing.
Sure.
Like, it's totally appealing. But this Crispin is kind of right on, and that is like, negative partisanship has been the primary driver of things for a while. If you pair Crispin's thoughts about negative partisanship with something like Michael Sandel's critiques of the administrative state and how you meant it from republicanism to administrative state to like I think in a crisis of the administrative state that's permanent, and I'm like, well, the reason why it's permanent, Michael Sandel, is because it's actually easy for legitimacy. The elite consensus can be washed by seeming like it's not a consensus by having two warring factions that get everyone caught up in it, and which they don't really have any
Right.
actual substantive political effect, particularly once you remove them from the local context. I mean, one of the ironies of always speaking against localism is it really makes national politics, or even more importantly, because as I believe, the structural way out of national binds is international. Otherwise, you're fucked no matter what. That stuff that Studebaker was talking about definitely applies between countries. Is that if you can't do localism, you actually can't do national politics either. And this has been a bind. And weirdly, Democrats are now learning what they learned 20 years ago under Howard Dean, but it's weird. And like the left is like kind of like, oh, I'm seeing people doubling down on the left, like oh, you know, these concessions to localism, and we need to go back to. I'm like, but you don't have an apparatus for national politics, and you don't have like. I guess this is another place where your point and Studebaker's point co-align in a different way. Studebaker points out that the DSA is popular in areas where Hillary Clintonites are the predominant political force. And I'm like, yeah, but that makes sense because they're an internal opposition. And that's real.
Yeah.
They also are doomed by that very fact, in the way Studebaker points out, because they don't have a lot of appeal in those areas where they don't, except to radicals and marginalized people who are going to be way more radical than the mainstream of the DSA.
Right.
Because they are pushed further out of their own society, but they can't do much except in the DSA itself, which is going to be seen as obstructionist and going to lead to all kinds of problems.
Right.
So,
I mean, I think the thing I would say there is that, like, here is a way of hearing my blackpilledness. I want to say there is no alternative to internal opposition. But by that, I mean, like, I don't mean that you do the same thing. There is no alternative to thinking about the same tactical and strategic questions. That's what I mean. Like, you have to live in the same space. You don't have to do the same thing.
I'm down with that. All right. On that note, we're gonna adjourn. Amogh, you interested in come back on in a month? I know you might have dissertation or whatever, right?
Bunch of things, but I'll make time.
All right, we'll come on and we'll talk a little bit. Hopefully, we can talk about this in some more specific terms. It's been a wild decade, Amogh. It's been 10 years that you and I have been analyzing the left from the left to the point that you and I both think analyzing the left from the left is actually a bad strategy.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, nope. That actually weirdly makes you stuck in a cul-de-sac that you can't get out of because you are also denying your own relationship to the rest of this. Maybe you should go back to analyzing society as a whole, of which the left is a symptomatic, to go back to our original title of our show, manifestation of. Like, it's actually showing us something about society as a whole, not just the dysfunction of the left.
Right.
And that is kind of worrying to a lot of people. So, and on that note, I'll see you in a month.